This video is about voltaic cells. By the end of this video, you should understand what a voltaic cell is, be able to identify the parts of a voltaic cell, and recognize the changes that occur as a cell runs. Before we dive into voltaic cells, let's take a second to look at the big picture. It turns out that we can use chemical reactions to produce electrical energy. The study of the interchange between chemical and electrical energy is known as electrochemistry. Within the field of electrochemistry, there are two types of electrochemical cells we'll be looking at in this unit. The first is voltaic cells. These are cells that produce current from a chemical reaction. A battery is the most common example of a voltaic cell. It uses a chemical reaction to produce electrical current. After this, we'll turn to electrolytic cells. This is the opposite. Electrolytic cells use an electric current to produce a chemical change, such as in electroplating, where an electric current is used to cause a non-spontaneous reaction to occur. Just to clarify, when we use the term cell here, we're not talking about the biological cell. Cell is just a term used to describe the apparatus that produces the chemical reaction. Likewise, you might also run into the term galvanic. Voltaic and galvanic cells are the same thing. Voltaic are named after Volta, galvanic are named after Galvani. These are two early pioneers in the study of electrochemistry. Now let's focus in on voltaic cells, the subject of this video. Voltaic cells are spontaneous redox reactions, meaning that the reaction will occur without any input of outside energy. Recall that redox reactions involves a transfer of electrons. If we're able to get that transfer of electrons to occur through an external pathway rather than directly from reactant to product, we can create a flow of electrons through a wire or a flow of ions in solution. Recall also that electric current is simply just flowing electrons. So essentially, by separating the oxidation from the reduction and forcing the electrons to flow through a wire, we're creating an electric current. There are several important components of a voltaic cell. The first is the anode. This is the electrode where oxidation occurs. The second is the cathode. This is the electrode where reduction occurs. Half cell refers to one of the two compartments in the voltaic cell or the battery, so each voltaic cell will have two half cells, an oxidation half cell and a reduction half cell. And a salt bridge will connect the two half cells. This will allow for ions to flow back and forth between the two half cells to prevent the buildup of charge. Once there's a buildup of charge, the battery will not run any longer, so we need to minimize this buildup of charge. Occasionally, instead of a salt bridge, you might see a porous disc or cup. This allows you to place one of the half cells inside the other half cell, and since there's pores in the cup, the ions can actually travel between the two half cells. A handy mnemonic for remembering where oxidation and reduction occurs is red cat an ox. Reduction occurs at the cathode, oxidation occurs at the anode. Red cat an ox. Now let's look at each of these parts in an actual voltaic cell. Let's consider the example of a voltaic cell pictured here. Together we'll label the parts. Notice that the overall redox reaction for this cell is shown at the top. Let's start by determining what half reaction is happening in each half cell. Each of these compartments is called a half cell. Together it makes up an entire voltaic cell. Since this is copper, and we see that copper is being reduced in this equation, we know that the half reaction happening in that half cell is the reduction half reaction. Likewise, since zinc is being oxidized, the half reaction happening in the zinc half cell is shown here, zinc being oxidized. Now that we know where oxidation and reduction are occurring, we can label our anode and our cathode. Recall that reduction occurs at the cathode, making our copper metal our cathode, and oxidation occurs at the anode, making our zinc electrode our anode. These pieces of metal here are called electrodes. Also notice that each electrode is submerged in a solution containing ions of the same atom the electrode is made out of. In the case of zinc, we have zinc 2 plus ions. In the case of copper, we have copper 2 plus ions. One last part of our voltaic cell is the salt bridge. This is the bridge that connects the two half cells. We'll look at this again in a second, but first let's consider the direction of electron flow. Since the oxidation half cell is losing electrons and the reduction half cell is gaining electrons, electrons will flow from the anode to the cathode. The zinc loses electrons, they're transferred through the wire, through the voltmeter, and over to the copper electrode. Now let's consider what's happening in the salt bridge. Consider the fact that each time a zinc atom from the electrode loses 2 electrons, which go through the wire, it will result in the formation of a zinc 2 plus ion. That zinc 2 plus ion goes into solution. Conversely, every time the copper ions in solution here gain 2 electrons, they'll form a neutral copper atom, which will leave the solution and attach to the cathode. This means that as the battery runs, the anode half cell would increase in positive charge, and the cathode half cell would decrease in positive charge. This buildup of charge is problematic because it results in a battery that will not run. The salt bridge allows for exchange of ions between the two half cells. Therefore, positive ions will flow from the anode to the cathode through the salt bridge, and negative ions will flow from the cathode to the anode through the salt bridge. This helps counteract the buildup of positive charge on the anode side and the buildup of negative charge on the cathode side. Generally speaking, the salt bridge can be something as crude as a paper towel soaked in NaCl solution. So if our salt bridge is an NaCl salt bridge, Na plus ions would flow from anode to cathode, and Cl minus ions would flow from cathode to anode. Now let's consider what happens as the voltaic cell or the galvanic cell or the battery, whatever you want to call it, runs. Here we have a picture of the same voltaic cell we saw in the previous slide. We've just put the cathode on the right and the anode on the left, but it's still the same cell. Also notice that here our salt bridge is KCl, which is another common option for salt bridges. As we've already said, as the battery runs, electrons will flow from anode to cathode because the anode loses electrons and the cathode gains electrons. Likewise, as we said in the previous slide, positive ions will flow towards the cathode through the salt bridge, and negative ions will flow towards the anode through the salt bridge to minimize the buildup of charge. Another interesting thing to consider is what happens to the mass of each electrode as the battery runs. Recall that as zinc gets oxidized, the zinc atoms become zinc ions, which leave the electrode. Therefore, the anode decreases in mass over time, since the zinc atoms go into solution as zinc ions. Conversely, copper ions at the cathode become copper atoms and attach to the cathode, causing the cathode to increase in mass as the battery runs. That brings us to the end of this video. Let's review our goals. First, we looked at what a voltaic cell is. Then we learned to identify the parts of a voltaic cell. And finally, we recognized the changes that occur as the cell runs.